never really expect the people who raised you to be the ones who betray you the most. But that's exactly what happened to me. My name's Dylan Carter, and I used to believe that no matter how unfair life got, family would always have your back. That they'd show up when it mattered most. That maybe, even if they never said it out loud, they'd at least care enough to stand up for what's right. But I was wrong. You see, my parents bought my younger brother Logan a brand new Tesla. Not just any Tesla, a top-tier Model 3 Performance, with all the bells and whistles. Price tag? $60,000, minimum. That car became his entire personality, his prized trophy. And somehow, no one saw the disaster coming but me. I watched Logan drive it like a maniac, burning through red lights, filming TikToks while pretending to nap on autopilot, even stumbling home from bars reeking of liquor, keys still in his hand. I warned them again and again, but every time, they brushed me off. You're just jealous, Dylan. Let him enjoy life. Then, one night, everything came crashing down, literally. At 3 a.m., I heard the front door slam, followed by frantic whispers and a car speeding away. Minutes later, Logan was dragged into the house, blood on his forehead, reeking of whiskey and adrenaline. The Tesla? Smashed into a tree like a crushed soda can. But instead of doing the right thing, my parents did what they've always done. They protected him and turned on me. They called a family meeting the next day, sat me down, and said the insurance wouldn't cover the damage. Then came the real gut punch. We think it's only fair that we all chip in. Translation? They wanted me to cough up $14,500, everything I'd been saving to finally move out of that suffocating house. Because Logan was broke, as usual. And Mom and Dad? Well, their emergency funds suddenly didn't look so generous anymore. I said no. And that's when it got ugly. 2 days later, the car was even more wrecked, windows smashed, mirrors torn off, dents everywhere. And somehow, my old baseball bat ended up accidentally discovered in the bushes near the garage. They tried to pin it on me. Said I'd vandalized the car out of spite. That was their plan, frame me for insurance fraud, to save the golden boy. But what they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that I had something they didn't. The truth. And what I found out next changed everything. Forever. If you've ever been the silent one, the overlooked one, the one they thought would never speak up, this is your sign. Thank you for watching. Drop a 1 in the comments if this story hit home. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. Looking back, it's almost funny how quietly resentment can grow when you've been raised to believe that staying silent is noble. I'm Dylan Carter, 25 years old, born and raised in Austin, Texas. I've always been the steady one, the one who doesn't cause trouble, doesn't ask for much, and doesn't complain, at least not out loud. I graduated college with honors, got a full-time job straight out of school, and even picked up weekend freelance gigs just to stay ahead of bills. Despite living under the same roof I grew up in, my life hardly resembles comfort. For years, I've been paying $500 a month in rent to live in my childhood bedroom, walls still painted the same dull beige from when I was 13, furniture barely changed. On top of rent, I help pay for groceries, split utility bills, and cover my share of household repairs like I'm some tenant, not their son. Still, I didn't complain. Not when I was pulling double shifts, not when I skipped vacations to build savings, and not even when birthdays passed with nothing more than a text or a grocery store cake. Because I believed, foolishly, that if I just kept doing the right thing, someday they'd notice. They didn't. But maybe I should have expected that, because this house was never really mine to begin with. Not when every room echoed with a name other than mine. Not when every proud smile, every warm gesture, every unearned praise was reserved for one person, Logan. And here's where it starts to make sense. Because to understand what happened with the Tesla, you need to understand who Logan Carter really is. If I was the steady one, Logan was the storm. 3 years younger than me, and somehow, always 10 steps ahead in our parents' hearts. He's 22 now, though you wouldn't know it by the way he floats through life like the rules were written for other people. He's never paid rent a single day in his life. Not once chipped in for groceries. Never cleaned a bathroom, changed a light bulb, or offered to mow the lawn. Yet somehow, in my parents' eyes, Logan walks on water. He's the golden child, and always has been. Even when we were kids, he'd break a lamp and I'd get the scolding. He'd skip homework, and I'd be told to set a better example. I spent high school working weekends at a hardware store just to save for college. Logan spent it sneaking into parties, missing curfews, and waking up hungover on the couch. Still, my parents defended him like a lawyer with a guilty client. He's just young. He's finding himself. Dylan, not everyone's like you. He barely made it through college, 6 years, 3 major changes, multiple failed courses, but when he finally got that diploma, you'd think he cured cancer. My mom was in tears. My dad popped champagne. And then came the surprise, the Tesla. It wasn't a reward, it was a coronation. Meanwhile, I was still driving a 2004 sedan that rattled every time I hit a red light. No upgrades. No celebration. Not even a pat on the back when I got my promotion at work. But Logan? He revved that Tesla in the driveway like it was his throne, bragging on Instagram, showing it off to friends, posting stories every hour like a king flaunting his crown. And every time I saw that car, I felt something tighten in my chest. Because I knew it was only a matter of time before it all went to hell. The Tesla wasn't the first time my parents made it painfully clear where I stood in the family hierarchy, it was just the most expensive reminder. Favoritism had always been part of our household rhythm, like background noise you learn to live with until one day, it's too loud to ignore. From the time we were kids, Logan was always the center of gravity. Every parent-teacher conference was about how Logan has so much potential while mine were rushed with polite nods and mild comments like Dylan's doing fine. When Logan got picked for the starting lineup in junior varsity football, even though he barely showed up to practice, it was front-page news in our house. My honor roll certificates? Stuffed into a drawer somewhere, probably under old tax files. It was the same story year after year, milestone after milestone. I still remember the day I graduated college, honors cord around my neck, diploma in hand, heart full of pride. I stood on that stage scanning the crowd, hoping to see my parents cheering, clapping, proud. But all I got was a curt hug afterward and a text the next morning. Congrats, son. We're proud of you. Hope you enjoy this, smiley face. Attached was a $50 Applebee's gift card, the kind you pick up near a gas station register. That was it. No dinner, no celebration, no family gathering. Not even a group photo. Meanwhile, when Logan finally graduated, it was a whole different story. He walked across the stage with a barely passing 2.3 GPA after 6 years of academic musical chairs, and my parents threw a backyard bash like he'd just been knighted. Streamers, catering, music, speeches, the works. Then came the grand finale, the Tesla. I stood in the driveway that day, watching him open the key box like it was a treasure chest, my mother snapping pictures for Facebook, my father saying, "You deserve this, son." And I remember thinking, if this is what he gets for scraping by, what did I do wrong for doing everything right? As the days passed, Logan's obsession with the Tesla went from obnoxious to outright dangerous. At first, it was just annoying, constant revving in the driveway, showing off the acceleration in front of anyone who glanced his way. He'd post TikToks pretending to sleep behind the wheel while the car cruised on autopilot, captioning it, "Tesla drives, I vibe." It was stupid, sure, but it got him likes. And that was all that mattered to him. Then the stunts escalated. He'd race through our neighborhood like he was in some street racing movie, ignoring speed limits, weaving around corners, burning rubber in grocery store parking lots. He thought it was hilarious. I thought it was reckless as hell. One night, I caught him pulling into the driveway, clearly drunk, stumbling out of the car, laughing, reeking of vodka and cheap beer. I stood there stunned. "Logan," I snapped, "are you out of your damn mind?" You could have killed someone. He just shrugged, tossing his keys in the air. Relax, man. It's a Tesla. The car basically drives itself. I brought it up to our parents several times. Each time, I was met with rolled eyes or a dismissive wave of the hand. You're always so uptight, Dylan. Why do you have to be so negative? Let him enjoy his life, you're just bitter. It didn't matter that I was right. It didn't matter that he was out there endangering lives. In their eyes, I wasn't warning them, I was whining. And deep down, I think I knew they'd never do anything about it. Because doing something would mean admitting that their perfect son wasn't so perfect after all. But I could feel it building, the way a storm simmers before the clouds break. And then, one night, it did. It was sometime past 3 a.m. when I woke to the sound of the front door slamming. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagine it, just the house creaking or a gust of wind outside. But then came the hurried footsteps. Frantic voices. A car engine roaring to life. I cracked open my door just in time to see my father rushing out, grabbing his keys. My mother was pacing the hallway, whispering furiously into her phone. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I stepped into the hallway. What's going on? My mother flinched, startled by my voice. She turned to me, trying to pull her expression back into calm. Your brother had a little accident. Your father's going to pick him up. A little accident? That was family code for major screw-up. I'd heard that phrase used before, usually when Logan did something they didn't want to explain. By the time my dad came back, the sun hadn't even begun to rise. I watched from the upstairs window as he practically dragged Logan from the passenger seat. My brother was limping, missing one shoe, and had a smear of dried blood across his forehead. He looked like he'd been in a bar fight, and lost. I didn't say anything. I just watched silently as they helped him inside, shushing him like a toddler who'd stayed up too late, not a grown man who had clearly just committed a felony. The next morning, I saw the Tesla. It was parked in the garage, hidden from view, but not from damage. The entire front end was crumpled like foil. The windshield was cracked, both airbags had deployed, and one of the front wheels was bent at a bizarre angle. It looked like it had been in a high-speed collision, because it had. That was when it hit me, he'd done it. Just like I warned them he would. He'd finally crossed the line. But instead of holding him accountable, my parents were already working on how to cover it up. By the next morning, the silence in the house was deafening. No one spoke about the wrecked Tesla. No one acknowledged the bloodied clothes in the laundry bin or the shattered car parts scattered in the garage like broken promises. But I knew something was coming. In our house, silence was never peace, it was just the calm before another storm. That afternoon, my parents called a family meeting. Let me tell you something, no one ever calls a family meeting to deliver good news. You don't sit people down in the living room to announce a vacation or a surprise inheritance. No, family meetings in our house were reserved for guilt trips, ultimatums, or carefully orchestrated manipulations. So I walked into the living room already bracing myself. My parents sat stiffly on the couch, that fake serious look plastered across their faces. Logan slouched in the armchair nearby, scrolling through his phone like the entire thing was a minor inconvenience pulling him away from his important TikTok schedule. His forehead was now a deep bruise, but he still managed to smirk every time I looked his way. My dad cleared his throat like he was about to make a formal announcement. Son, he began, we've assessed the damage to your brother's car. I said nothing. Unfortunately, he continued, the insurance won't cover the cost of repairs. I waited for the next line. I already knew it wasn't going to be an apology. It never was. We think it's only fair that we all contribute, together, as a family. I blinked. You want me to help pay for his wrecked Tesla? My mom chimed in, her voice laced with that soft, practiced guilt. You're the only one with savings right now. We just thought, since you've been doing so well. My throat tightened. All the late nights, extra shifts, skipped weekends, I hadn't saved that money for Logan's mistakes. I'd saved it for my freedom. And now they wanted to rip it from me, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they didn't want him to suffer. That was the moment something cracked inside me, not just disappointment, but something deeper. They weren't asking me to help. They were asking me to sacrifice myself, again. And this time, I wasn't sure I could. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out or slam doors. I just sat there, staring at them in disbelief. "No," I said quietly, but firmly. The room went still. Even Logan paused his scrolling. "I'm not paying a cent for this," I continued. "He drove drunk, crashed the car, and you want me to clean up the mess? That's not family, that's exploitation." My dad's jaw tightened, his face flushed the way it always did when he didn't know how to argue but didn't want to lose control. My mom's eyes widened with disbelief, then narrowed into something colder, sharper. "After everything we've done for you," she said, voice trembling in that fake wounded way she'd perfected over the years. "We've sacrificed so much." "Really?" I said, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Like charging me rent for my childhood bedroom while Logan lives here for free? Or ignoring every achievement I ever had while throwing parties for his participation trophies?" That's when the guilt-tripping began, full throttle. "This is a chance to help your brother get back on his feet," my dad said, clasping his hands like a disappointed pastor. "Don't be so selfish," my mom added. "Family supports each other in hard times." I wanted to laugh. Hard times? Logan had been coddled his entire life. He'd never seen a hard time. And now, they were treating my boundaries like some kind of betrayal. The manipulations kept coming, little jabs disguised as concern. "You've always been more mature. You're the responsible one. Logan just needs a little help." And all I could think was, how many times do I have to bleed before you finally notice I'm wounded, too? I stood up without another word. Their disappointment echoed in the room behind me, but I didn't turn back. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, fists clenched, heart heavy. I thought that would be the worst of it. But I had no idea just how far they'd go, until 2 days later. 2 days passed in tense silence. No one brought up the money again, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Meals were quieter. My parents barely made eye contact. Logan stayed locked in his room, probably sulking because his golden pedestal had a crack in it. Then, early Saturday morning, I was jolted awake by a loud, metallic clanging, like someone beating a garbage can with a bat. I scrambled out of bed, peered out my window, but saw nothing unusual. The sound had stopped as quickly as it started. I figured it was nothing, until later that morning, when I walked downstairs and heard shouting from the garage. What I saw stopped me cold. The Tesla, already damaged from the crash, now looked like it had been savagely destroyed. The windshield was completely shattered. Every window smashed. The side mirrors were hanging by wires. Deep dents marred both doors and the hood. One headlight was missing altogether. It didn't look like a car anymore. It looked like a war zone. "What the hell happened?" I asked, stunned. Logan spun around, rage painted across his face like a rehearsed act. "You tell us, man. You did this." I stared at him, stunned. "What?" My dad held up something like a smoking gun, my old metal baseball bat, the one I hadn't touched in years, the one I kept buried in my closet behind a pile of storage boxes. "We found this in the bushes by the garage," he said coldly. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The bat, they planted it. I knew it in my gut. And in that moment, something darker than betrayal began to settle in my chest. They weren't just trying to gild me anymore, they were trying to frame me. Before I could say anything, my mom stepped in, arms crossed, her expression icy. "Don't lie to us, Dylan. We heard you leave your room last night." I laughed, short, disbelieving. I didn't leave my room. I was asleep the whole night. But it didn't matter what I said. Their minds were already made up. Or worse, this had been the plan all along. You've always had a temper, my dad added, that fake concerned voice making it worse. This wouldn't be the first time you acted out. My chest tightened. I wasn't just being blamed, they were rewriting reality. Years of built-up frustration twisted into a convenient narrative. Dylan, the jealous, bitter older brother, the angry one. You're serious? I said quietly. You think I'd do this? Logan folded his arms, smug now. Who else would? You're pissed I got the car. You're pissed they asked you to help. You've been brooding for days. The way he said it, so casual, so smug, it made my skin crawl. That's when I knew this wasn't about a car anymore. This was about control. About power. They wanted to bury me under a lie, just like they'd buried every time they looked past his mistakes and covered for him. But now, they were willing to go one step further, sacrifice me to protect him. I stood there, staring at the three of them. My mother, the manipulator. My father, the enabler. My brother, the fraud. And I realized, this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. By Monday morning, I could barely sleep. My parents were still playing their roles like seasoned actors, cold, distant, quietly whispering behind closed doors. Logan was back to his smug routine, walking around the house like nothing happened. But I knew something they didn't. There was no way I was letting them get away with this. When the insurance investigator showed up that morning, I made sure I was the one who opened the door. He was a middle-aged guy named Mac, wearing a wrinkled button-down tucked into khakis, a notepad in one hand and a digital camera in the other. He looked unassuming, but his eyes were sharp, like he'd seen every trick in the book. My parents greeted him with overly polite smiles and that overly rehearsed tone they used when trying to seem respectable. We're just devastated, my mom said. This kind of thing, it's so unlike Dylan. I almost laughed out loud. Mac went straight to business. He took photos of the Tesla from every angle, examining each crack, dent, and shattered window like a surgeon studying X-rays. He didn't say much, but you could see the wheels turning in his head. After an hour of inspection, he asked to speak with us one-on-one. My parents insisted on going first, of course. I sat quietly in the kitchen while they disappeared into the other room. I could hear bits and pieces, words like temper, outburst, and he's been struggling emotionally. The smear campaign was in full swing. When it was my turn, I sat across from Mac at the dining table. He looked at me, pen ready. Tell me about Friday night, he said. I told him everything. That I was home. That I'd heard the commotion in the garage the next morning. That I didn't touch that car. Then I paused, and offered a detail I'd kept in my pocket. By the way, I added, our neighbor across the street, Mr. Lawson, he just installed a new wide-angle security camera last month. It might have caught something. That was the moment everything shifted. Mac's eyes lit up. That's very helpful, Dylan. 2 days later, Mac called me directly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of disbelief under his words. I think you'll want to see this, he said. Mind meeting me for a quick follow-up? I met him at a nearby coffee shop. He was already there, laptop open, a stack of papers beside him. No small talk this time, just business. He turned the screen toward me and hit play. There it was, 2:13 a.m., Saturday morning, clear as day. Logan. On camera. Walking outside, baseball bat in hand. Calm. Methodical. He walked up to the Tesla and began smashing the windows. One by one. Then the mirrors. Then the hood. He even looked around before smashing the windshield, like he was checking for witnesses. There was no hesitation. No panic. He wasn't angry, he was executing a plan. When the footage ended, I leaned back, stunned, even though I'd suspected it, seeing it was something else entirely. Mac let out a slow whistle, shaking his head. 15 years on the job, he muttered, and this is one of the dumbest frame jobs I've ever seen. He tapped a folder beside his laptop. I've already sent the footage to the fraud department. The insurance claim's dead. We're escalating it to legal. I nodded, speechless for a moment. There's more, Mac added. We also checked your neighbor's camera logs. There's no footage, none, of you leaving your room, sneaking out, or going near that car. He paused. They really tried to set you up. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen again, watching my brother's face freeze mid-swing. Something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about the Tesla anymore. This was about everything they'd ever done, every time they ignored me, dismissed me, sacrificed me for Logan's convenience. And now, finally, I had proof. When I got back home that afternoon, the air inside the house felt heavier, like the walls themselves could sense the shift that had just taken place. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have yelled. My parents were in the kitchen when I walked in. Logan was on the couch, legs stretched out, phone in hand, pretending like he wasn't watching my every move. Then my dad asked it, too casually, like it was just small talk. So, everything go okay with the investigator? I paused, met his gaze, and let the moment stretch. Then I nodded. Yeah. He got everything he needed. That was it. No details. No explanation. Just a calm, deliberate answer. But I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. My mother's smile tightened just slightly. Logan looked up from his phone, a little less smug now. They had expected me to play along, to stick to their script. Maybe they thought I'd fold under pressure, like I always did before, swallow my pride, keep the peace. But not this time. Later that evening, it exploded. My mom cornered me in the hallway, voice rising, eyes wide. Why would you say all those things to the investigator? Why would you throw your brother under the bus like that? I stared at her, stone-faced. I didn't throw anyone anywhere. I just told the truth. Her face contorted, disbelief morphing into rage. You've always resented him, haven't you? No, I said quietly. I resented being treated like I don't matter. My dad jumped in, trying to regain control with his usual authoritarian tone. You better fix this. Call them. Tell them you misunderstood. We don't want this to escalate. But it was too late. They knew the game had changed, and for the first time, they weren't the ones holding the cards. That night, I went to bed not with fear, but with clarity. Because this wasn't just survival anymore. This was justice. A few days later, Matt called again. His tone was different this time, lower, more deliberate. Dylan, I thought you should hear this directly from me. We met again, same corner table at the coffee shop, same laptop, same quiet intensity in his eyes. But what he had to share this time wasn't just about the Tesla, it was about a pattern. He pulled up a file and tapped the screen. This wasn't Logan's first insurance claim, he said flatly. I leaned in, confused. There were 2 prior incidents. Both involving vehicles. Both suspicious. One was labeled as accidental property damage, the other marked as vehicle theft, but the reports were vague, inconsistent, and had red flags all over them. I felt my stomach tighten. Were they covered? I asked. He nodded slowly. Both claims were paid out. Substantial amounts, too. But here's the thing, both times, your parents were heavily involved. The initial reports came from them. Logan barely spoke to the investigators, just signed paperwork after the fact. He scrolled through another page. There's no direct evidence of fraud in those cases, yet. But when you line them up with this one, it doesn't look good. I sat back in my chair, stunned. All these years, I thought Logan's luck was just frustrating favoritism. But now, it looked a lot more like a pattern of cover-ups, insurance manipulation, and a family willing to bend the truth for their golden child, again and again. My thoughts spiraled backward. The weird repairs we weren't allowed to talk about. The mysterious accidents followed by new electronics or sudden spending. The vague explanations my parents gave when bills got tight. It wasn't just about this Tesla. It never had been. And for the first time, I started to wonder how far this had really gone, how many times they'd swept things under the rug, how many lines they'd already crossed without me even knowing. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a history. After that meeting with Mac, I couldn't think straight. My mind kept looping through memories that once seemed insignificant, but now carried a weight I hadn't recognized before. Little things that suddenly didn't feel so little. Like the time, 2 years ago, when Logan came home late, shaken and pale. His car had a fresh dent in the bumper, and there was blood on his shirt, not his own. I asked what happened, but my mom stepped in quickly, saying it was just a scare, that he'd hit a deer. We weren't allowed to talk about it after that. The next week, that car disappeared, replaced by another. I thought it was odd back then. Now, it felt like a cover-up. And then there was the strange hush money situation. I remembered a heated conversation my parents had behind closed doors, thinking I wasn't home. My father mentioned wiring money to someone to make it go away. I brushed it off at the time, assuming it was about a bill or loan. But what if it wasn't? What if that money was part of a private settlement? A payoff? I started digging through old records, financial statements, anything I could find. That's when I noticed a strange pattern, large, unexplained withdrawals around the same time as each of Logan's accidents. Transfers to unfamiliar names, bank memos labeled vaguely as consulting or repairs. Even worse, a friend of mine, who works in legal administration, did a quiet search through public records for me. What she found sent chills down my spine, a sealed juvenile record tied to Logan. No details, but the timing matched that hit-and-run night. My parents had buried it all. Every screw-up, every legal threat, every consequence, hidden, sealed, paid off. And now it made perfect sense why they were so desperate to protect him again. It wasn't just about shielding Logan from this one mistake. It was about keeping the entire web of lies from unraveling. Because if one thread came loose, the whole damn thing would fall apart. And this time, they were willing to burn me with it, just to keep the truth buried. That night, I sat alone in my room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan the only sound breaking the silence. I stared at the wall for what felt like hours, not really seeing it, just trying to hold my thoughts together while something inside me quietly came undone. It wasn't just about Logan anymore. Or the Tesla. Or even the money. It was the unbearable weight of always being the afterthought. I thought back to my childhood, how I used to sit at the dinner table, hoping for someone to ask how my day was. How I used to bring home perfect report cards, thinking they'd finally be proud. How I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, helped more, maybe then I'd matter. But I never did. I was never the son they celebrated, just the one they depended on when things needed fixing. The silent filler in the background of Logan's highlight reel. The responsible one. The one who was always expected to understand, to sacrifice, to give without asking. And now, after years of swallowing that pain, of watching them excuse his failures and punish my success with silence, they had the audacity to frame me. To treat me not just as the backup plan, but as the disposable one. My hands trembled as I thought about it, how many times I'd told myself to let it go, to not make waves, to be the bigger person. But being the bigger person had only ever made me smaller in their eyes. I looked around my room, at the walls that had witnessed years of buried anger, quiet tears, and forced restraint. And something finally clicked. No more silence. No more guilt. No more playing the role they assigned me. They wanted to protect their golden boy at any cost? Fine. But I wasn't going to be the one paying for it anymore. They'd written their script, but now, I was rewriting the ending. The official response from the insurance company came 3 days later. A plain envelope on the kitchen counter, unassuming, almost forgettable. But what it contained was anything but. Claim denied. The words practically screamed off the page. The letter detailed that the incident was classified as intentional vandalism, staged for fraudulent purposes, and as such, not eligible for coverage. It also noted that the case had been forwarded to their internal fraud investigation division and that legal authorities were being contacted for follow-up. I sat at the table with the letter in my hands, watching the color slowly drain from my mother's face as she read over my shoulder. My dad grabbed it next, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he scanned the bolded lines. "This can't be right," he muttered. But it was. Everything they had tried to hide, every manipulation, every lie, every whisper behind closed doors, was unraveling in front of them. They'd gone too far this time. They'd pushed one cover-up too many. And for once, there was no shield, no excuse, no way to shift the blame. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The letter had done the talking for me. Later that day, Matt called to confirm the next steps. He said the company's legal department had filed a formal complaint with the State Insurance Fraud Bureau. Things were moving quickly. "I've also submitted the security footage to local authorities," he added. "Expect to hear from a detective soon." My parents stood in the hallway that night, whispering furiously. I could hear phrases like damage control, lawyer, and how do we fix this? But there was no fixing this. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a crime. The next week moved faster than any of us expected. On a crisp Wednesday morning, a police cruiser pulled up to our driveway. The officer calmly walked to the door and asked for Logan by name. My mother tried to stall, insisting there must be some mistake. But there wasn't. Logan was arrested on the spot. He was charged with DUI, insurance fraud, and filing a false police report, all backed by the surveillance footage and Mac's official report. When they handcuffed him in front of our house, the entire neighborhood watched. Curtains were pulled back, phones peeked from behind blinds, whispers spread like wildfire. For once, the golden child wasn't walking on water, he was drowning in the weight of his own consequences. I stood quietly at the top of the stairs as they walked him out. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. Just deflated. Like reality had finally caught up to him, and he didn't know how to run from it anymore. But the fallout didn't stop there. The investigation into my parents' role in the cover-up uncovered involvement in previous suspicious claims. Though they weren't charged criminally, the insurance company hit them with a hefty civil penalty, and their names were added to a high-risk fraud database. Their home insurance rates skyrocketed. Their financial reputation, once clean and quiet, was now branded with suspicion. And the embarrassment? That was almost poetic. The same people who used to brag at neighborhood dinners, post family photos of Logan and his Tesla, and beam with pride about his potential, were now the same ones ducking their heads at the grocery store, pretending not to notice the stares. They had always been so concerned with image, with perception. But no Facebook filter could blur out the consequences now. After everything that unfolded, it didn't take me long to make my next move. Within 2 weeks of Logan's arrest, I packed up the last of my things, loaded them into my old sedan, and drove away from the house that had never really felt like home. No goodbye. No parting words. Just silence, and a freedom I hadn't felt in years. I found a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. No guilt hanging in the air. No footsteps outside my door at midnight. No whispers behind walls. Just peace. A few weeks after settling in, I got promoted at work. Higher pay, better responsibilities, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't working just to survive, I was building something for myself. I even enrolled in MBA night classes, something I'd always wanted but never had the space, mentally or financially, to pursue. And oddly enough, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel alone. I felt lighter. Some nights, I'd catch myself thinking about everything that had happened, the lies, the gaslighting, the years of being sidelined in my own family. But the pain that once weighed me down now felt like background noise. Faint. Distant. Manageable. Because I'd finally stopped trying to earn love that came with conditions. I didn't lose a family. I lost an illusion. An illusion that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, proved myself enough, I'd be seen. I'd be valued. But you can't earn your place in a house where your worth was never recognized to begin with. And walking away from that? That wasn't loss. That was liberation. I thought I'd closed that chapter for good. But just when I'd started to breathe easy, the past found its way to my doorstep, literally. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when I heard a knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. And there they were. My parents. Standing awkwardly in the hallway, clothes rumpled, faces worn down by stress and desperation. My mom clutched her purse like it was the last thing holding her together. My dad's eyes darted behind me, as if trying to peek into the life I'd built without them. We didn't know where else to go, my mother said, voice cracking. For a second, I said nothing. Just stared at them, these people who had thrown me under the bus without flinching, now standing outside my door like lost children. They didn't even try to ease into it. They launched right into the pitch. The house is being foreclosed, my father said. The bank's frozen our accounts. We're in over our heads. We thought maybe, my mom added quickly, you could help us, just until we get back on our feet. The same hands that tried to frame me were now outstretched, begging for help. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt hollow. Because in that moment, I realized something painful and profound. They didn't come because they regretted what they'd done. They came because they had no one else left to bleed dry. As expected, the next card they played was the old favorite, guilt. You're all we have left, Dylan, my mom whispered. Logan's in jail. Your father's lost his job. Everything's falling apart. We're still your family, my dad added. Whatever happened, we should stick together. Blood is thicker than water, son. Funny, how suddenly they remembered we were family, now that they needed me. Where was that sentiment when they handed me a $50 gift card after my graduation? When they tried to empty my savings for a drunk driver's wrecked car? When they staged a crime scene to ruin my future? You're not being fair, my mom said, her voice trembling with the familiar performance she always used when she wanted sympathy. I didn't take the bait. Because I wasn't the same person standing in front of them anymore. They wanted me to feel guilty for not saving them. But what they really couldn't handle was the fact that I'd saved myself. And now, standing in the doorway of my own life, on my terms, I saw them for what they were. Not family. Just people who were only loyal as long as I was useful. And that era of me being useful to their dysfunction was over. I looked at them one last time, calm and unshaken. You didn't raise a son, I said quietly. You raised a scapegoat. You didn't protect me, you used me. And now you're here, not because you're sorry, but because you're desperate. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. Don't. I've said everything I needed to say. My mother's eyes welled with tears. But even then, I saw it wasn't remorse, it was regret for losing control. I stepped back and began closing the door. I hope you figure things out, I said simply. But not at my expense. Not anymore. And with that, I shut the door, softly, firmly, finally. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like freedom. Because for the first time in my life, I hadn't just escaped their house. I'd escaped their grip. Since walking away, I've spent a lot of time reflecting, not just on what happened, but on who I've become because of it. And the truth is, for most of my life, I mistook endurance for love. I thought sacrificing my needs, my boundaries, even my dignity, was what it meant to be a good son, a good brother. I believed that if I just held it all together long enough, they'd finally see me, appreciate me, choose me. But they never did. Because people who are committed to misunderstanding you will never see your worth, no matter how brightly you shine. And family? Family should never be the first place where your value is questioned, or your silence mistaken for loyalty. I used to think drawing boundaries was selfish. That walking away from people you share blood with meant giving up. But I've learned the opposite is true. Sometimes, drawing the line isn't an act of rebellion, it's an act of self-respect. Sometimes, refusing to carry their dysfunction isn't betrayal, it's healing. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to someone who's spent their life stepping on your peace is just one word: no. I used to feel ashamed for not fitting into the role they carved out for me, the quiet fixer, the fallback plan, the emotional sponge. But now, I feel proud that I outgrew it. I'm not bitter. I'm not angry. I'm just done. And in that quiet ending, I found something I'd been chasing for years without even knowing it. Not revenge. Not recognition. But peace. Looking back on everything, the lies, the setup, the legal chaos, I can honestly say I wouldn't change a thing. Because every bruise, every betrayal, every cold stare across the dinner table led me here. And here is better than I ever imagined. If you're someone who's ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever felt like the emotional dumping ground in your own family, hear this. You don't have to carry the weight of their expectations. You don't owe anyone your silence, your savings, or your sanity just because you share a last name. You're allowed to walk away from people who make you feel small. You're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to choose yourself. Because the people who love you for real will never ask you to destroy yourself to keep them comfortable. So now, I'll leave you with this. What would you do if your own family tried to destroy your life to protect someone else? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or speak up and finally find your freedom? Sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that set us free. And sometimes, walking away from the people you love is the only way to finally come home to yourself. If this story hit close to home for you, if you've ever felt like you were carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with, just know, you're not alone. Drop a comment. Share your story. Speak your truth. Because maybe, your voice is exactly what someone else out there needs to hear today.